Commercial leasing involves two parties with different objectives: a tenant looking for space that supports its business, and a landlord seeking to lease space on terms that protect the value of the property. In most significant commercial lease transactions, each side is represented by a broker. The tenant representation broker works for the tenant, while the landlord representation broker works for the property owner. Although both brokers are working towards the same transaction, they do not have the same responsibilities. Each broker is expected to advocate for the interests of their own client. The commercial leasing process therefore involves market research, property marketing, financial analysis, competing proposals, and the negotiation of numerous lease terms. The tenant representation broker, often called the tenant rep broker or just the tenant rep, represents the business or individual seeking to lease space. The broker does not represent the landlord, even though the broker may communicate regularly with several property owners and landlord brokers. The process usually begins with an assessment of the tenant's needs. This may include the amount of space required, preferred location, the rent budget, parking needs, building quality, lease commencement date, and anticipated future growth. The tenant rep broker then surveys the market to identify available and suitable properties. The broker may review numerous possibilities before selecting a smaller group of spaces that appear to satisfy the tenant's requirements. Once suitable options are identified, the broker prepares a comparative analysis. This allows the tenant to compare properties side by side rather than evaluating each option in isolation. The analysis may consider quoted rent, operating expenses, lease term, available concessions like free rent, tenant improvement allowances, location, accessibility, and the condition of the space. The broker's role is not simply to locate a vacant suite. The broker helps the tenant understand the economic and operational differences among the alternatives. One of the tenant broker's most important strategies is creating leverage through competing proposals. Instead of negotiating with only one landlord, the broker may submit proposals to several landlords at about the same time. Each landlord then knows, or should assume, that the tenant has other viable options. This competition can improve the tenant's negotiating position. A landlord may be more willing to reduce the rent, provide additional free rent, increase the tenant improvement allowance, or agree to otherwise more favorable lease provisions when the landlord believes the tenant could choose another building. Commercial leases are highly negotiable. The negotiation is not limited to just the advertised base rent. The parties may negotiate things like rent escalations, periods of free rent, tenant improvement allowances, the length of the lease, any renewal options, expansion rights, or other provisions that affect the tenant's occupancy. For example, one building may offer a lower base rent but provide little money for improvements. Another landlord may charge a higher rent but provide a substantial allowance to build offices, conference rooms, or specialized space for the tenant. The tenant broker helps the client evaluate the entire economic package. Over a long lease term, relatively small differences can produce substantial savings. This is why a skilled tenant rep broker may save a client hundreds of thousands of dollars over the life of the lease. Now let's flip sides and look at the landlord representation broker. This broker works for the property owner. The landlord broker's first responsibility is often to market the available space. That may include listing the property on commercial real estate platforms such as CoStar or LoopNet. However, commercial leasing is not entirely dependent on online listings. The broker may contact businesses directly, communicate with tenant brokers, distribute marketing materials, and use signs at the property to attract interest. The landlord broker also needs to understand the building and the available space in detail. Prospective tenants may ask about rent, operating expenses, parking ratios, building access, available improvements, lease timing, and the landlord's willingness to modify the space. Effective marketing therefore requires more than advertising that space is available. The broker must present the property as a solution to the operational needs of prospective tenants. Once a qualified tenant expresses interest, the landlord broker begins negotiating on behalf of the owner. Many of the same terms considered by the tenant broker are also important to the landlord. The base rent, rent escalations, concessions, tenant improvement allowances, lease term, renewal rights, and expansion options. The difference is perspective. The tenant broker seeks flexibility and lower operating costs. The landlord broker seeks reliable income, an appropriate return on any improvements that they spend, and terms that preserve the property's value. The landlord must also consider the quality of the tenant. A tenant offering a high rent may not be attractive if the business has weak credit or a high risk of default. The landlord broker's goal is therefore not necessarily to obtain the highest possible stated rent. The broader objective is to secure a qualified tenant under terms that provide dependable income and protect the owner's investment long term. At the negotiating table, the tenant broker and landlord broker represent opposing interests, but both are working toward a completed lease. Each broker attempts to create leverage for their client. The tenant broker may emphasize competing buildings and alternative locations. The landlord broker may emphasize the quality of the property, limited availability, or interest from other prospective tenants. The negotiation of rent, concessions, tenant improvement allowances, lease length, and option rights is where the economic substance of the lease is established. This is also where brokers often add their most visible and measurable value. A broker may create value by finding a better space, reducing occupancy costs, attracting a better tenant, limiting vacancy, or negotiating provisions that better protect the client. The key lesson is that commercial leasing is not simply a landlord quoting a rent and a tenant accepting it. It is a structured process in which both sides research the market, evaluate alternatives, attempt to create leverage, and negotiate a complete package of financial and operational terms.